Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. You guys voted for it, so now I'm going to rank every Rush studio album from worst to best. It's time for Rank Under Pressure. Rush have 19 records. I really need to add to my Rush collection, so while I don't own all of the albums here, I have opinions on all of them. So with that being said, let's get started. Kicking things off in 2007 with Snakes and Arrows coming in at number 19. And, I want to preface this by saying that I don't think Rush has a bad album or a worst record per se. Just some that aren't as strong as others. So something has to come in last year. And I personally could never take the Snakes and Arrows from '07 as much as their other albums. I think it's definitely their weakest of their three 21st century records. And this album definitely could have benefited from tracks like The Main Monkey Business, Brave as Face, and Good News First being cut for time, I think. Snakes and Arrows is one of the band's darkest thematically, and so you combine that with a bloated record and three underwhelming instrumentals, and it kind of makes for a challenging listen despite having some gems on it as well, like Far Cry and Workin' Them Angels. Coming in at number 18, I'm going to go with Test for Echo from 1996. This is an album that definitely suffers from having filler on it that drags the album down, but don't get me wrong, I still really enjoy tracks on here like Limbo, Resist, the title track, Virtuality, Driven as well. The rest of the album though is just pretty uninteresting. It's underwhelming, and I'd say probably the least entertaining Rush album to go back and listen to. Just kind of the band going through the motions by the mid-90s, and a pretty disappointing follow-up to the much stronger Counterparts from a few years earlier, which I'll get to in a little bit. Number 17, gonna go with Hold Your Fire from 1987. Hold Your Fire is a mixed bag for me. On one hand, I think the lyrics are great, dealing with themes of, aging and cynicism in real world, and I like the collaboration with Amy Mann on Time Stand Still. Force 10 is a great opener too, but on the other hand, I feel like the band's experimentation got a little out of control here at times. They definitely overindulged a bit here with the synths. The production is geared a little too far towards the cheesy radio sound of the mid-80s for my taste, and, of course, there's the Chinese classical-inspired Tai Shan, which, I applaud the band for, trying to branch out further and be experimental. That's one thing about Rush. They were never afraid to, try new things in the studio. It's one great thing about their catalog, but I just don't think it fits well on this album, and I think the more time passes, the more dated this record sounds, and I just don't think it's aged as well as their other synth-era albums. So coming in at number 17, let's go with Hold Your Fire from 87. Number 16, let's go with Vapor Trails from 2002. The band's return from their hiatus following the Test for Echo tour, which wrapped in 1997. And Neil Peart, I need to make a point of saying Neil Peart, because if I say Neil Peart, people get upset with me, but his name is Neil Peart. The real answer is, why can't we just call him Professor and be done with it? But anyway, Neil fell on some tough times after the death of his wife and daughter, during that hiatus, and so there were, certain points where they didn't know if they were even going to come back. But Rush bounced back with Vapor Trails, an album that, I really feel bad about ranking so low on the list, because I like the material in here a lot. Tracks like Ghost Rider, Earthshine, One Little Victory, and that really powerful drum intro, to kick off the record, making Neil's Defiant come back here. But the album really suffers from poor production. It's really marred down by that. It sounds really muddy. Nothing really gets to breathe. And of course, the lack of Alex Lifeson guitar solos doesn't help things either. So I definitely enjoy this album a lot more when listening to the remix. But when it comes to the original version, have to put it down towards the bottom. So coming in at number 16, let's go with 2002's Vapor Trails. Number 15, let's go with Roll the Bones from 1991. Just not top shelf Rush in my opinion. More of a return to a guitar-based sound as the band moved into the 90s, and the synths took a bit of a step back here, kind of following the footsteps of Presto, and it's fine for what it is. I think the title track is much stronger live than on the record, although I can never really take to Geddy's rapping on that track, and I know it's meant to be cheesy and kind of tongue-in-cheek on purpose, but otherwise too, the production is kind of thin and tinny. But that said, I still really dig tracks like Ghosts of a Chance and Dreamline, and even for entries down towards the bottom of this list, it has some great moments, they all do. And so, to be honest, the bottom of this list, making the bottom, was a lot harder to put together than the top. So, number 15 here, let's go with Roll the Bones. Like I said, not quite top shelf Rush, but it definitely does have its moments, just like all the other albums I've talked about so far. For number 14, let's go all the way back to the beginning here in 1974 for their self-titled debut album. Very much inspired by hard rock bands like Led Zeppelin and Cream. The band's debut is, a very solid rock album. It's a great rocker of a record here. There's some heavy stuff, especially for its time as well. But if you look at it against the rest of their catalog, seeing that this is Rush before they took on a more progressive sound, it sounds like the band's still in their infancy compared to the more mature and complex work they go on to do in, a short period of time after, right? Not to mention, it's the only Rush record without Neil Peart. He'd replaced John Rutsey after this album, and, of course, course, I don't need to tell you guys how important Neil Peart is to, Rush and their songwriting, of course, but his lyrics and thematic leadership really did help take the band to the next level. But still, this album is a solid rocker of an album here. Very strong debut, in my opinion, with some standouts that include Working Man. Got to be my favorite song on here. Just got a monster riff to it. Before and after, let's see here. Here Again, Take a Friend, Need Some Love, Finding My Way. There's some good stuff on here, and so I do enjoy it, but like I said, compared to the rest of their catalog and the more progressive stuff they do in the years that would follow, not as strong. Number 13 is going to go to 1989's Presto. It's really the beginning of the end of the synth era for Rush, with a return to more guitar-driven arrangements here, and I think the synth material had run its course by 89, and with the changing music scene, I think it was time for the band to move on, and this album is a bit underrated, despite being buried in the band's catalog, which is rather expansive. I really enjoy the album's lyrics and catchy melodies. Geddy Lee sounds really good here on lead vocals. Love his voice from this era, and it's not a perfect album. I mean, sure, the mix is a bit flat in places, but I just really love tracks like Scars, Chain Lightning, and the anthemic War Paint, my favorite song on this record, and lots of hidden gems on here. I think it's a great transition album for the trio, and this is a tour I would have loved to have been able to have seen them on. Number 12, going to go with Caress of Steel from 1975. Rush released two very fine studio albums in 1975, those being Fly By Night and Caress of Steel. Of the two, Fly By Night I think is much stronger. I'll get to that one in a little bit. But when it comes to Caress of Steel, it has some great moments too, despite not being received, super positively upon its release. Rush really picked up where they left off on, Fly By Night, delving even deeper into the newly found progressive sound, and this album is more proggy than Fly By Night for sure. Really their first true prog album from beginning to end, with standouts like Bastille Day, Lakeside Park, The Necromancer, and the 20-minute epic Fountain of Lamenth. It takes up all of side two, which I really enjoy. It's a really ambitious undertaking for the trio, who were still new to prog at that point, but obviously there was a lot of improvement left for them to grow, but I think in general this album is pretty underrated and shows the band continuing to get more comfortable with the progressive sound. At number 11, how about Power Windows from 1985? Rush continued to pursue a more synth-heavy sound with Power Windows as the follow-up to Grace Under Pressure. Love the sampling and use of electronic drums throughout. Rush were throwing a lot of different things at the wall here to see what would stick, and it's not just a synth rock album, but you have prog here, you have some new waves, some art rock, so it's a very diverse record, right? And I really dig it. I love the experimentation on display on standouts like The Big Money, Manhattan Project, Territories, and more. Happy 40th to Power Windows, a real cohesive album, and one that I think succeeded in the band's mission to take from the best of the two previous records, those being Grace Under Pressure and Signals. Moving into the top 10 here, I'm going to go with Clockwork Angels from 2012. A great way for Rush to close out their catalog. It's their final studio album and one of my favorite final albums in rock history. The band, sound revitalized here in the studio. Compared to Snakes and Arrows, it's like night and day, and it's a really cool concept album here. I love the way it just builds and builds throughout. I think the album is structured really well. Standouts for me include Caravan, great opener, the title track, Headlong Flight, Wish Them Well, and The Garden to close things out. A really driven and focused album here by the band for sure. A late career gem, no doubt. Favorite song on here, have to go with The Garden. Such a masterpiece with really profound lyrics written by Neil Peart on one of, if not the final recordings of his career. Number 9, going to go with Counterparts from 1993, one of Rush's heaviest and darker sounding albums. This is the band taking inspiration from groups like Primus, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, etc. And there's something to be said for a band being able to make, a relevant and fresh sounding record during the height of grunge that is still an aggressive, proggy listen, and that's what makes Counterparts so enjoyable for me. Some standouts include Cut to the Chase, my favorite on the album. I just love that guitar solo. Nobody's Hero, Cold Fire, Animate, and more. Definitely my favorite Rush album of the 90s, coming in at number 9 here on the list. Got to go with 93's Counterparts. Number 8, Fly By Night, also from 1975. Like I said, there were two albums released in 75, and this one came first, before Caress of Steel. This is a crucial album to Rush's development, their sophomore record, and the first with Neil Peart. With Peart in the band as their main lyricist, they were able to explore more complex lyrical themes compared to their debut, as well as, taking on more of a progressive sound that we all know and love. Bytor and the Snow Dog was a huge step in the right direction for the band when it comes to getting more progressive, more proggy. Other standouts for me include the classic title track, Best I Can, Anthem, and the great Lord of the Rings inspired ballad Rivendell, which is just a great way to kind of slow things down a bit on the record. Probably my favorite song there. Rush sound like a different band compared to, their debut just a year earlier, and I think you can attribute a lot of that to the Professor joining the band and kind of being that creative spark the band needed to get to the next level. Number 7, 1984's Grace Under Pressure. The band band took a calculated risk on Signals, moving further into their exploration of synths, sequencers, and other electronic instrumentation, and continued that direction on Grace Under Pressure 2 years later. And while it's not as strong as Signals in my opinion, Grace Under Pressure gives, more prominence to guitars than its predecessor, while also including elements of ska and reggae into some of the material as the band continued to branch out further and further, so I really dig that. And as for my favorite song on here, I gotta go with Between the Wheels, but I love After Image, Red Sector A, and The Enemy Within, too. Number 6, let's go with Hemispheres, released in 1978, an incredibly well-crafted album by Rush, who were creatively exhausted after the tour for A Farewell to Kings, but they reconvened back in the studio to work on new material, where they once again nailed it out of the park with an increasingly more complex record that only took the band 2 weeks to write and record, with no preconceived ideas prior to re-entering the studio, which is very impressive. I love the 18-minute title track, which, takes up all of side 1 of the album. La Villa Strangiato is, one of the band's greatest instrumentals as well, and my favorite track on here, though, has to be The Trees. Just, great songwriting here from Neil Peart. Just insane creativity by the band, who really found their groove by 1978. Top 5 now, let's go with A Farewell to Kings from 1977, the follow-up to their breakthrough 2112, and I just love the way of the track listing on A Farewell to Kings. It's a great mix of longer, more progressive and drawn-out tracks like Xanadu and Cygnus X1, Book 1, The Voyage, as well as shorter tracks like Closer to the Heart, but most importantly, the band continued to branch out, with Neil Peart adding a variety of bells and percussion to his drum kit, and the band beginning to use pedal synths, as well as Geddy Lee adding a mini Moog to his repertoire as well, so some big steps in, a different direction as the band continued in their evolution of their sound here on my number 5, A Farewell to Kings from 1977. 1982, Signals comes in at number 4 here on the list, and, it would have been easy for Rush to, coast after release of the masterpiece Moving Pictures and Exit Stage Left as well, but the band decided to take a huge step forward instead. It's an album that really feels like, the band following the natural evolution of their sound after Moving Pictures helped to reinvent the use of synthesizers in hard rock, and the end result was, let's add in more keyboards, right? And that's what Rush did. Signals marked the most radical change, I think, in the band's sound to date. Also experimenting with a techno-style reggae on Digital Man, and maybe a little bit of dance rock as well on The Weapon. I'm not sure, maybe a little bit, but the only downside is the use of synthesizers came at the expense of the prominence of Alex Lifeson's guitar, but this was a bold reinvention from the band, and one that I think has aged really well. Also, it outlined the rest of their 1980s, and personally, I can't even decide on a favorite song from this record. Probably a 3-way tie between Analog Kid, Subdivisions, and New World Man. Maybe you guys can help me break the tie in the comment section below. The top 3 are really close together. It's like choosing between 3 perfect albums here, but coming in at number 3, getting us started in the top 3, I'm going to go with Moving Pictures, an album so good I have it on both CD and vinyl, right? Great album here. Of course, you have the classic Tom Sawyer, a track they play on rock radio all the time, but no matter how many times they play it, I never get tired of hearing it. You have the awesome YYZ instrumental, or is it YYZ? Limelight has a monster riff to it, and of course, Red Barchetta, but, I even love the lesser talked about tracks on this record. Songs like Camera Eye, Vital Signs, Witch Hunt, really side 2 of this album. It's one of Rush's finest hours for sure, an absolutely timeless record to get us started in the top 3. Gotta go with Moving Pictures from 1981. It's a really tough call, but I gotta go with 2112 at number 2 here on the list. This was the first Rush album that I ever heard. Specifically, the title track was the first Rush song I had ever heard as well. All of side 1 of this record, right? And all 20 minutes of it. When I first heard 2112, my mind was blown, and well, it really needs to be listened to in one piece. The Temples of Syrinx is my favorite part. Probably, my favorite Geddy Lee vocal performance of all time. And side 2 is great as well. You've got Passage to Bangkok, which is a great song, a lot of fun. Lessons, The Twilight Zone, Tears, Something for Nothing. Top to bottom, this is just epic stuff, an incredible album, and, Rush were pressured at the time, to go in a more commercial direction by the label, but they were more interested in pursuing prog, and so somehow they managed to do both seamlessly here on 2112. There's a little something for everybody on this record. It's a progressive rock essential for sure, my number 2 on the list. Just the more I thought about it, the more I thought, there's no way I can't put this album at number 1, so my favorite Rush album, at least for today, like I said, my top 3 are very close together. It could be totally different, like next week, but for right now, my favorite Rush studio album at the time of this recording has got to be Permanent Waves from 1980. No way I could couldn't put this at number one. It's classic Rush through and through, and yet seamlessly adaptable to the radio-friendly sound of the 80s, and it's Rush taking a very confident step into the new decade here with some of their most memorable material. Tracks like Free Will, The Spirit of Radio's got great lyrics, it's an awesome opener as well. Jacob's Ladder is great, Different Strings, Natural Science is killer. I love Geddy's vocals on this record as well, taking a more restrained vocal delivery compared to previous releases, and just from beginning to end, Permanent Waves is a great blend of prog and commercialism, and a very fun and consistent listen throughout as well. So, coming in at number one, my personal favorite Rush album of all time, at least for today, has got to be Permanent Waves from 1980. So that wraps up Rank Under Pressure, ranking the studio albums of Rush from worst to best. You guys can see my picks right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload. We'll have more discography rankings to come. Thank you to everybody who voted in the poll and chose Rush as the next ranking. Typo Negative came in second place, so they'll be the next discography ranking here on the channel, and then I'll put a new poll up because this has just been a lot of fun, right? So hope you guys are enjoying it, having as much fun with it as I am, but please let me know down in the comment section below your thoughts on my list. What are some of your favorite Rush albums, and where do they fall on your ranking? I definitely want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.